Right, well, hello everyone. I won't say good afternoon or good morning because I know that it's at least both for two of the participants. But welcome to the University of Bath and to a joint seminar between the Institute for Policy Research, the Centre for Development Studies at Bath, and for the second time, we're running this jointly with the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at the University of Coventry. And our main speaker today, who I'm delighted to welcome back, I think for the fourth time to speak at Bath that I can remember attending anyway, is Michael Woolcock from the World Bank, who needs no introduction, I'm sure, to many of you. And we're very lucky, I think, to have the chance to hear Michael reflect on the World Bank Reversals of Fortune, Poverty and Shared Prosperity report that was released, I think, just in October. I think there's a huge amount in the report to digest. I hope some of you have had a chance to look at it already. And I hope that Michael will also share maybe a little bit of the experience of the process of putting it together as well, given that the world was a very different place, I imagine, when you started to plan it, no doubt in 2019, if not before, compared with the way the world was in October 2020 when it was released. So that's the main menu for today's seminar. I'm going to ask Michael to speak for around 30 minutes, maybe a bit more. And then Zainab Maiborna from Coventry University will be our first discussant and share a few comments and reflections and questions. And she will be followed by Santosh Mehrotra, who is beaming in from Delhi. So good evening to Santosh as well. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for your questions. There is also a Q&A function, which we've made fully open, so you can see questions as they accumulate from the attendees, and you can upvote questions that you like, and that'll enable me to make sure we pick up the ones that you're most interested in. Please do keep your cameras and microphones switched off, and use the Q&A function, as I say, to submit your question, and I will then read it out when we get to that stage of the proceedings. And just to say finally that the session is being recorded and filmed, and so we will make it available over the various Centre and Institute websites afterwards for those who've expressed an interest and couldn't attend it. And so I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to pass on now straight away to Michael.
Thanks, James. Thanks for inviting me back to my first simultaneous presentation into Bath and to Coventry. I think that's a first. So thank you very much for doing that, and thanks to all of you for joining. I will do my job today if in effect sort of facilitate a conversation around a very difficult set of issues, but ones that nonetheless we need to be discussing, all the more so perhaps in the light of the challenges the world is confronting right now. So obviously and manifestly in the coronavirus situation, but as we'll see, other events as well that are making the historic task of poverty reduction so much more difficult. I'm just going to bring up my screen, and then I'll just give you some broad introductory remarks about the context for this particular report and its status, as it were, within the genre of documents that the World Bank produces each year, and then proceed to give you the key messages that emerge from the report itself. Okay, so I'm hoping now that you have the full screen. Can someone just give me a sign that you are doing that? Unless I will assume you are. All right, thanks very much again.
All good.
Yeah, all good, excellent. The Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report is a biennial document. That means it comes out every 2 years. It was instantiated in 2014 when the World Bank formally articulated its twin goals. So those twin goals being to promote the elimination of extreme poverty, measured by the extent to which the number of extreme poor people in the world would get to or below 3%. That's consistent with the first of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And the second was to promote shared prosperity. And by shared prosperity, we mean the growth in the bottom 40% of the income distribution in each country. That is one way of looking at the poverty reduction, and then by extending it by looking at the ratio of the growth of the bottom 40 to the rest of the population, what we call the shared prosperity premium, that becomes a measure of the rise or fall of inequality. Not perfectly, but that's just the way that it was chosen to be done. I'm going to be talking primarily about extreme poverty measure, which since 1990 has been the amount of $1.90 per day, adjusted periodically for cost of living, etc. But that particular number, though it's extremely low, is the poverty line roughly from the bottom 15 countries of the world. In the report, we also discuss the poverty lines from middle-income countries, the lower end of the middle-income countries being a poverty line of $3.20 per day, and then at the upper middle-income countries, poverty line of $5.50 per day. We also report on what we call a societal poverty line, which is a line that rises as we go from the poorest countries to the richest countries. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's there in the report if you would like to consider it. We also talk about various different multi-dimensional aspects of poverty, which various scholars have been promoting for many decades now. That's an interesting story as well, which I won't go into, but the report itself certainly does. The first Shared Prosperity Report came out in 2016, the second one in 2018, and so here we are in 2020. The original vision for this report, and I'll discuss this perhaps a little more detail as we go along, was built around an expectation that poverty reduction would still be occurring in the world, but at a slower pace than it had been in recent years, and a slower pace than it had been over the last 30 years. And that was consistent with all the numbers that we had roughly this time last year. And the idea was to try and write a report that was going to both explain that slowdown, but then try and look in more detail at what we might do to accelerate and the speeding up of poverty reduction to meet this goal of reducing extreme poverty to below 3% by 2030. As James indicated, and as we all know, the world became rather different from the first quarter of first third, I guess, of this year, once what was hoped would be a temporary blip became a historic, history-altering event. And that had huge consequences for our report, because suddenly we went from having a message of explaining a slowdown to a reversal. And that's hence the title of this particular report, The Reversal of Fortune. And we will discuss as best we can some of the ways in which we think that reversal might itself be reversed. That said, I think it's important to stress that, as I've indicated, this particular document, this particular genre of report that the World Bank produces is best understood more as a report card, as it were. It's not a world development report. It doesn't make any big claims to be articulating a deep theory of poverty, or to outline a comprehensive strategy for how the world should respond to the pandemic. All of that is not the mandate or the mission or even the possibility, really, at this time for this kind of report. So I think some people expect it to say more than it does, but at least when we were in the full engine room production stage of this report in June, July, and August, it was still very uncertain as to the magnitude of the impact of COVID, and it was even less clear what the optimal set of policy strategies should be to deal with it. And we still live with that. And so trying to write a report that was going to deal with inherent uncertainty and fluidity was one of the huge big challenge, especially for me, I guess, more personally, since it fell to me to do a lot of the writing around the explaining and the documenting of what might be done in response to all of this. But I'll talk about some of those things later on. So that's the stage. I will now proceed just to take you through the key messages of the report in the time I have left, and then I'll turn it over to our discussants to give this their sense of things. Okay, so there are four sort of main messages, if you like, and the first, the grimmest message, is that the expectation is now that the world will not be able to reduce extreme poverty below 3% by 2030, and in fact not really get anywhere near close to that, precisely because, well, there isn't just a slowdown anymore. There's been a historic reversal, and this is the first time really since the World Bank began tracking global poverty in 1990, so in 30 years, essentially, a generation. And this is the largest that we've seen in a change in, or certainly an increase in poverty since that time. There was a slight blip, as we'll see in a slide shortly, around the Asia financial crisis in 1997, 98. But that was, historically at least, and numerically at a global level, that was largely a blip. What we are now dealing with is the worst setback since we started measuring poverty, and from a global economy point of view, the biggest recession since the Great Depression, and the biggest in 80 years. So these are enormously consequential events that are obviously, perhaps not so obviously, but it certainly are hitting the poorest people in the world, and the poorest country, certainly the poorest people in the world, much more than they are affecting everybody else. Such is the nature of this setback that we expect roughly 100 million people or more will be pushed back into extreme poverty over the next few years, between now and the end of next year, bringing the total number of people in extreme poverty to roughly 700 million plus. All the numbers I'm presenting here were based on the projections that we took forward from June, when the World Bank produces its every 6 months it produces these global macroeconomic indicators, and we use those to extrapolate poverty. I'll say a bit more about that particular issue shortly. Either way, the first time since 1998, the global extreme poverty rate will now rise to between 9.1 and 9.4 in 2020, and roughly that same again in 2021. The most recent estimates that have been done and published on blog posts, so these, I'm not divulging any secret information, but the people whose job it is to keep close tabs on all these numbers and to were the key contributors to this report, their blog numbers recently are showing that, if anything, we'll be on very much in the high end of those initial projections, and perhaps even beyond that. So, and we had a session last week with DFID where the number crunchers there were comparing their assessments with ours, and all of it's roughly consistent with this what we thought was going to be a worst case scenario type situation back even in September when we put the final touches on this report. All the projections since then are unfortunately showing that things are going to be worse. The main drivers of this are what we call the 3 C's: conflict, climate, and COVID, obviously. And those three are compounding each other. That in itself is a very messy issue to untangle, because it's each of these unfolds on very different time trajectories. They play out differently in different geographical contexts. Conflict obviously tends to be more concentrated, whereas climate change is happening everywhere in different ways. And COVID itself is playing out with enormous heterogeneity across the world, as we've seen in recent months. So all of this is the primary drivers, and we'll look, as I said, shortly into the effects of each of these three as we go forward. Most of the projections that I'm presenting to you are primarily driven around the effects of the global economic slowdown on poverty. That's the closest coupling to a real-time measurement that we can get. At a more granular level, we have teams around the world right now, as I speak, conducting lots of rapid phone surveys to try and get a better sense of who and where the pandemic is playing its greatest effects out. Conditional, of course, on the fact that many of the poorest people are not able to access cellular technology. So all of those issues have to be incorporated as well. But the projections we're working on now come from these macro indicators. I say that because people sort of think that we've got this massive big dashboard somewhere at the World Bank basement where we've got these dials and indicators all flipping around and measuring global poverty. The reality is that there are just large numbers of people, but they're working with poverty data, household level survey data that comes in from countries all over the world who we're roughly following similar protocols, because there's a community of practice around these things, obviously, and these people hang out at conferences and discuss the best way to do a household survey on poverty, etc. But at the end of the day, these documents are sovereign. They're owned by countries. They obviously have the right to assess poverty in the way they think is best, and to use it for the purposes they think is best, and the extent to which any of that then neatly aggregates and enables poverty assessments from Panama and Paraguay and Pakistan to all line up in a nice little graph that I'll present to you shortly, is very much an issue that methodologists wrestle with, and my colleagues wrestle with every day, trying to ensure that there is some degree of harmonization that's possible, and accurate inference being able to be drawn from all this vast array of surveys, tools that are being done. These surveys are done to align, for this report at least, around the year 2017. And that's not to say we're 3 years slow. It's just to say that's how long it takes to do these surveys, to clean them up, to make sure that we are comparing true apples with apples when we are comparing poverty measures in different countries. So it'll even be several more years, another 3 years, before we truly have the granular level of sophisticated assessment of all of this that we would want to have. So even my colleagues who will do the 2022 Poverty and Shared Prosperity report still won't have the full assessment of COVID yet. At that time, it'll take much longer for that to happen. So all this has been part of my education through this whole process, just to realize how much effort and energy goes into producing these seemingly very cute and clean and colorful graphs. There's just a whole engine room of people and meetings upon meetings upon meetings to make sure that everybody's happy with how things have been done, and the methodological protocols have all been upheld. And we're very conscious that these become very significant to how the world talks about poverty, and ultimately then how it tries to respond to it as well. The upshot of a lot of this, though, is that we are left with a situation where in the absence of these 3 Cs, in the absence of climate change, COVID and conflict, we'd still be having a slowdown. We'd still back to where we were a year ago. And that would still mean that we had to be working very hard to try and keep the extreme poverty rate declining. And that agenda can't be forgotten. The fact that there are more people back in extreme poverty is tragic, and we need to have one agenda spelt around trying to deal with that, and more broadly with the pandemic itself, at the same time as we don't take our eye off the longer group of chronically poor people who would not have been intended to, had it not been for the kinds of processes that we're discussing right here. So we've got this twin imperative, as we call it, to focus on the immediate challenge of COVID and its impacts on poverty and lives and livelihoods, but also to try and recognize that there's this slow-moving group of people that are still living in extreme poverty and who we wish would not be living that way. So I've indicated some of these things already. Some of the features of this particular report. We have these individual estimates for across 3 different individual country assessments across 3 different lines, the ones I just mentioned before, timed up until 2017. We can aggregate some of these into regional poverty estimates. We can't do that for South Asia for reasons I'll discuss very soon. And we are able to look at shared prosperity measures roughly in this wave of surveys, the data that we have between 2012 and 2017. The shared prosperity indicator is much harder to measure, not harder in a technical sense, just harder logistically to do, because we need 2 surveys to be done, and getting very granular levels of income and the shifts in income across 2 time periods in a whole array of different countries is just very hard to do. It's the number of countries in the sample is increasing steadily each year, but it's still not anywhere near what we would want it to be for a fully comprehensive statement about shared prosperity in the world. But we still only have 91 countries. That means we're still 100 short for a global assessment of how those trends are going. Nonetheless, there's been improvement. The big challenge we face this year, and that any global poverty report faces, is that by definition, the numbers that we are referring to are hugely influenced by the world's biggest countries. So if a small country like Guinea-Bissau, for example, was suddenly able to become super prosperous overnight, that would barely have an effect on the global poverty numbers. That would be great for Guinea-Bissau maybe, but it wouldn't have a huge big impact on global poverty, because that number is driven primarily by the fortunes of the very biggest countries like India, Nigeria, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Congo. Those are the big countries where the effects of the rise or fall of poverty are hugely influential then on the global numbers. So we tried very much to stress that the spirit of these goals, of course, is that poverty reduced in each country, even though the basic logic of how this discussion happens means that we can mostly see the big effects on global poverty just by concentrating policy efforts on the largest of those countries. But one of the potential consequences of that is when we don't have data for one of those big countries, it can make a huge big hole in the report. And unfortunately, India, for its own reasons that I won't go into, elected not to release its poverty data for this particular report. So we aren't able to produce numbers on India, and by extension on the South Asia region, because India is the largest country in South Asia. But we did in May finally get the Nigeria data, which was really important because we hadn't had an update on the Nigeria numbers in nearly a decade. So that was very important for our story around Africa to have the Nigeria numbers. So as I said, all this data is timed or is calibrated to be comparable around the year 2017. So we then produce what we call nowcasts, which are taking that 2017 data and projecting it forward to 2020. And then we do some forecasts into the future, since the goal was to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. We look at the extent to which these trajectories of poverty reduction were making it more or less likely that the world was on track to meet those particular targets. As I've indicated, that's not going to happen, and I will show you that graphically very shortly. So it's all these big effects are just being driven, as I said, by these 3 C's, and that's what I want to now try and unpack a little bit more. So here's one of these seemingly very simple and straightforward graphs on the left, showing both the numbers and the percentage rates of poverty in the world. The number of human hours that go in producing those numbers are incalculable. But I think, as much as the situation is dire right now, I think it's important to recognize that the poverty rate, certainly when I began my career in the late 80s and early 90s, was a world in which well over a third of the whole world's population was living in extreme poverty. And now we're down into single digits. And that's for all of the other legitimate concerns that we have about the world and the price that we've paid in some sense for that to happen. I think if you had to ask which end of that graph you would prefer to live in, and I think most of us would choose the right-hand side of that particular graph. So that's one thing. The second is that you'll note the steady decline up until around about the year 2012-13. There was on average a 1% per year decline. And if you just extrapolated what the world thought back in 2013, what the World Bank's leadership thought back in 2013-14, we thought, well, just basic math says if we've got 1% per year, let's assume that's going to happen for another 15 years, and we'd get a 15% number, well down to 3% by 2030. That was the basic hope that was expressed back in 2014. But since that particular time, perhaps with some, not inevitability, but just the nature of trying to reduce extreme poverty could just be that it just gets harder and harder to find and to locate and to include people when you're getting into the most extreme forms of poverty. But either way, since 2014, the annual rate of poverty reduction has then since fallen to about 0.5% per year. At least that's what it was until 2017. The table on the right just looks at the reductions in shared prosperity, and you can see there, I think, a pretty mixed story. You see East Asia and the Pacific at the very top, where there has been very significant growth, disproportionately significant growth in the bottom 40% of the income distribution, in 4 of the 5 countries on which we have data. But in large parts of Latin America, especially, and in lower and middle income countries and upper middle income countries in particular, the rate of growth of the bottom 40% has been much more mixed, or indeed not happening at the rate at which we wanted to. So there's a very much a mixed story here, at least in the inequality sense. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I guess I'm just part of the point of these talks is just to let you know that to get at these kind of issues at the level that researchers would want them to is still many, many years away. The world just does not have the kind of data it needs to unpack these things, at least to tell a global story, even though we have lots of very committed researchers focusing on the situations in particular countries. When you scan the world more generally, it's just much more difficult to find a consistent story about what's happening with multidimensional poverty, and with inequality, and the rates and places and groups for whom this poverty reduction process is playing out or not. So here we go, looking at then the nowcast. That was looking up the previous slide, look up until 2017. Here we are looking up till 2020 now and into 21. Absent COVID, we expected that the effect would be that I'd be giving you a report estimating that there'd be roughly around about 8% of the world now living in poverty, which is still a pretty dramatic decline. Even from 3 years ago when it was 9.2, it would have been very reasonable to assess that in our lifetime, or especially for younger attendees today, that their professional lives would overlap with a world in which extreme poverty was in fact achieved. But as a result of COVID, as those dotted lines at the top show, we estimate the poverty rate this year will be between 9.1 and 9.4, most likely the higher end of that, and now into 21 going to be roughly the same. So the effects of this particular event, at least so far, suggest it's been a 3, perhaps 4-year event that the effects have put us back 3 years to where we were. And as we'll see shortly, when you don't then just look at the projections based on economic growth, but look at it as a function of inequality, and we recognize, as I think we are increasingly recognizing, that the effects of COVID are having highly inequitable responses in each population. People like you and me can stare at laptops for a living, whereas most poor people have to earn their living manually, have to do it in close proximity to other people, and are living much more on a hand-to-mouth existence. And so the effects of lockdowns, the effects of social distancing, and their close proximity to many other people, not just their own family members, means that they're going to be disproportionately affected economically and from a health perspective by a pandemic. So once we factor all that in, the situation's much more grim. The graph on the right just looks at the projected effects of the effects of the pandemic on shared prosperity, and you can see that most of the countries on this particular slide are on the right-hand side of that diagonal, which means that they will have a lower shared prosperity. That means the income growth of the bottom 40% will be lower than what it will be for the population as a whole, which means there's going to be a widening increase in poverty and correspondingly wide increase in inequality as a result of COVID. So all the things that we hoped would not be happening are in fact happening, and that's going to put enormous stress on poor people in the short run and the most immediately and consequentially, but for researchers and analysts and for policy makers and practitioners who are trying to do something about all of this, it just means that our task has got much harder. So that's the first C. The second C is conflict. And what we're able to do with this particular report is take the idea of mapping, of poverty mapping, and overlay that with places in the world where the incidence of poverty, incidence of conflict is highest. And when you do that, you can produce maps like the one on the right and look at those dark blue areas, which are the ones where you simultaneously have the highest levels of poverty and the highest levels of ongoing conflict. In an earlier report that colleagues at the bank produced earlier this year, they noted there that only 10% of the world's population overall lives in fragile and conflict and violent countries, the FCV countries as we call them. But even though they only make up 10% of the world's population, 40% of the world's poor people live in those countries. So and this will rise probably to 2/3 even over the course of the next decade. So from 40% to 66, 67% over the course of the next decade. So as consequential as COVID is in the short run, in the medium run, the big challenge is to figure out this perennial human question of how to stop us killing ourselves and to ending wars. And of course, there's no deep theory and strategy for that either, but it's just the empirical reality is that poverty and violence are going to be increasingly coterminous or co-located over the course of the next decade. And one can't really then have a serious poverty reduction strategy without one that's also simultaneously committed to reducing extreme poverty. What we also did with this report was to commission a background paper looking at the longer run effects of poverty, because the challenge isn't just to end a war, that's obviously important. Another very sobering message from the report and based on this paper that was produced for us was the enduring effects of conflict, up decades or more beyond when the war has formally ended. The mental health effects, the nutritional effects on children, the lost years of education, all of these effects continue to play out long after the war is over. And so the imperative here is, of course, to prevent the wars happening in the first place. And that sort of question of prevention and preparedness, I'll come back to at the end, because I think that's a sort of boring topic, but it's super important for trying to deal with these kinds of challenges. Excuse me. The third C is climate change. And here again, there's other colleagues and other parts of the bank have wrote a report back in 2015, a very high impact, high profile report called Shockwaves, which was the first full assessment, excuse me, of the effects of climate change on global poverty. And we asked these guys to update their numbers for us for this particular report. And they estimate now that another 100 million people just by 2030 will be pushed back into extreme poverty as a result of climate change. Their more sobering message to us has long been that 2030 is important, but it's not anywhere near where the big effects are going to be happening. The big effects of climate change will play out in 2040, 50, and 60. But obviously they will be bigger the less we do now to try and stem the effects of climate change. So the huge big challenge is this massive time inconsistency problem, where all the big effects are going to happen long into the future, many administrations later in any particular political cycle. But all the work really needs to be done now to stop those kinds of effects from having devastating effects on rural communities in particular, where the big effects of climate change are going to affect rainfall or droughts and the productivity of soils and the spread of diseases. All sorts of things all happen in an awful way once temperatures start to rise. But humans face this perennial collective action problem of how to act now to stop something that will play out long after most of today's senior leadership is long gone. We measure the effects of climate change this time with the first attempts to also map out not the overlap of not just the effects of poverty on conflict, but the effects of poverty and climate change. And we use here the incidence of floods. Just because that data is available, it's an imperfect measure. It is not the measure of climate change, because obviously places that are drought prone aren't going to have flood risks. But nonetheless, it helps because droughts affect everybody, whereas floods, even in very tightly packed urban settlements, will have very differential effects. On those people that live well above the waterline will be fine, and those people who live in the poorest, most vulnerable housing stock are going to be those that have the most vulnerable to experiencing the effects of floods. So it's pretty important data or interesting analyses, I think, to try and look at some of that. So we present some of that in the reports, which I've got a slide about that coming up shortly. So the implications of all this are that, unfortunately, the goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030 is, for all practical purposes, not going to be attained. Only historically unprecedented rates of both economic growth and poverty reduction, economic growth and inequality will achieve that. It's too sobering. There's a slide in one of the annexes of the report just showing what the effects of higher inequality will be on, even when it's coupled with high rates of economic growth. And you never see that line ever come down. The line just keeps rising, and that's just too scary to even present in a public forum. So we won't go there, but just the message, even on with more modest hopes, is still one that we need to be much more committed to redoubling our efforts to reach those that are the chronic poor, those that were already living in extreme poverty prior to the 3 Cs, but now have been joined in their number by this group we call the new poor, the people that have been put back into extreme poverty as a result of the effects of COVID. All of these are, the 3 effects of climate conflict and COVID are slightly altering the profile of the global poor, because the new poor aren't just an extension of they have different demographic and geographic characteristics to those that were chronically poor. I'll show you that on the next slide. But I think the report tries to show very strongly that there won't be a really serious response to poverty, global poverty, until we can figure out simultaneously how to get the pandemic under control, how to get violence under control, and how to make much longer term commitments to addressing the climate change problem. Which we note in the report, I think importantly, that many of these kinds of challenges that we face are themselves products of globalization, are effects of an integrated world that enables the unwelcome aspects of globalization to travel much faster, like diseases, like weapons, laundered money, refugees. I mean, all the people that are going to be most affected by the bad things of globalization are now bearing the effects of that. And it's a very sobering message that much of the policy of instruments that we invoke to try and promote economic growth open up pathways by which less desirable processes can unfold as well. And that means we need to have a much more judicious and more effective regulatory structure built around the way in which we engage with and manage our globalization. So here's the one basic slide on sort of looking at the different effects of rates of growth and different levels of inequality. On this particular growth, this growth projections on the right largely are done to look at a 1% increase in the effects of poverty, effects of inequality at different rates of growth, and you can see there's very different lines there. The rate that it would require to get it down in a baseline scenario even was very, very high rates of growth that are just in the parts of Africa where, as we saw, the effects of conflict are just so endemic. That's just unrealistic to expect that kind of growth to return. So the curve is only going to be keeping on flattening out, and even quite ambitious rates of economic growth really just aren't likely to get us there. If those rates of economic growth, as I indicated, rise to 2%, then, as I said before, those lines don't ever flatten out, they just keep increasing. And that's a much more scary situation to consider. So that's the kind of scale of the challenge that we've now find ourselves in, and we recognize this as a generational challenge. This is the moment that we face in ways that our grandparents and great-grandparents faced equivalent challenges earlier on. I mentioned this new poor, so I have a few slides left. I just want to show you what we think are some of the characteristics so far on the basis of the rapid phone surveys that have been done. These are being updated as I speak, so this is, but at least the story that we seem to be finding is just providing more details and interesting variation around this kind of story. The blue line just represents the characteristics of most poor people in the world, the most people living in extreme poverty. Most of those are living in rural areas, have no education, are primarily employed in agriculture, are self-employed or work in some form of family business or much smaller operation. The new poor are different on every single one of those dimensions. They are more urban, have some education, are based in manufacturing and services, and have some form of wage employment as opposed to being self-employed. There's not enough of them yet to alter the overall global profile, but if we're, from political and ethical standpoints and just pragmatic standpoints, needing to be focusing on dealing with the pandemic in the short run and protecting lives and livelihoods, we can't just double down, in effect, on the policies that we have for dealing with chronic poverty. That we need to have very different kinds of strategies. Those will then, I think, tend to center much more on social protection mechanisms of getting cash and resourcing to people in the short run to be able to tide them over. One would hope that in rural settings, in urban settings, that there could be, excuse me, a faster recovery, just because there might be more diverse employment opportunities available to people once the pandemic has passed. But nonetheless, there's this twin imperative of being focused on the blue lines and the orange lines simultaneously is the big task going forward. But conscious always that all of this work is still in the blue countries in particular is actually happening in places that are very violent and in places that are likely to experience the most devastating effects of climate change now and in the future. So,
Michael, another 4 minutes.
Got it. Yep, I'm 2 slides from being done. So this is just another way in which we can look at the effects of overlapping all of these places in then what we call these hotspot spaces, where all the 3 Cs line up to create really, really difficult circumstances. And that's, as you can see, the sub-Saharan African map there, where you have the very high rates of poverty corresponding with high rates of conflict, corresponding with high rates of incidence of climate change. And all of those just are, as I said, increasingly concentrating the situations in the world where poverty is being now experienced. But as we try to show, this is a global report, and so other countries, and even richer countries, as a result of COVID, are experiencing massive levels of unemployment, and all of that. Those issues we hope can still be addressed, even though our primary focus in this report is on extreme poverty. And on the right there, that was just really trying to show that there are these very particular places where the incidence of poverty and flood risks overlap, and where that then overlaps again with conflict. And you can see on there Nepal, for example, which isn't currently a country in conflict, but it's a nice country, or a nice example of a country suffering from conflict debt, a country that is still paying the price, as it were, for its conflict now, even though the conflict ended many years ago. Okay, so what do we do about all of that? Well, it would be presumptuous and premature for the bank to declare write out a big laundry list of strategies that it thinks needs to be done, but we nonetheless tried to do something along those lines, at least trying to highlight some of the ways in which countries around the world are already responding to this, to these 3 Cs, often, and sometimes 2 or 3 of them simultaneously. And I'll have a few words to say about that on the next slide. But the implication is that we just really do need to focus on dealing with COVID. It's just all the other things, all the resourcing, all the political bandwidth that we need for dealing with the chronic poor can't really be addressed until the most immediate effects of the current crisis are dealt with. And so that puts a very strong premium on protecting lives and livelihoods right now. And it means also this, but doing both of these things simultaneously, because the extreme poor are just likely to be even more extremely poor, even though this won't register in the big national surveys. Everything would suggest that those that are already very vulnerable, living in extreme poverty, their situation's got even worse. So that means that the development community needs to be doubling down, in effect, on all of this, but hopefully also learning and heeding the lessons that have been gained along the way. So what we try to stress in the concluding chapter is not just we provide these examples, as I mentioned, of very promising work from India, from Niger, and other places where the moment has been seized to try and find creative ways of dealing with extreme poverty in urban environments, or in India, where there's been a need on the eastern coastlines to try and deal simultaneously with cyclones and with COVID. Amazing responses there, but we don't make any big declarations about whether these are the way in which it should be done. We're just trying to highlight examples of innovation at scale that have been undertaken in various different countries and around the world. The important point here, we also stress, though, that is as much as it's important to have good policies in place, for these kind of things to really work, as it were, then we just need to have very dedicated and effective implementation systems in place to turn the aspiration into reality. And this was in the original version of the report. This particular aspect was going to be highlighted much more than it was able to be in the current one. But nonetheless, I think as we're seeing around the world, even in Western and European countries, just enormous heterogeneity with respect to how countries are choosing to respond to these things with very different kinds of effects. And we need to be much more conscious, I think, as a development community on investing in the improving of our implementation systems as much as we might want, obviously, to ensure that the optimal policies themselves are articulated. As was very clear to our team writing this report, there is so much that still remains unknown or undiscovered because of the absence of data that we need. And that's true not just at the global level when we're trying to measure these big trends in global poverty, but right now, as the world needs to learn in real time about how to what is working and what isn't with regards to helping people to comply with mask wearing or social distancing, or for those that have to make very hard decisions to close down their businesses. How one undoes any of that under this kind of existential pressure is historically unprecedented. And so humans have to learn, or the systems have to learn, governments have to learn, private sector has to learn, societies have to learn, and all of that is just going to keep requiring more and better data to be able to, in various different forms, to help us to be able to do that learning process as efficiently and effectively as possible. As I mentioned earlier, we try to stress the importance here also of preparedness and prevention. Many of these awful things that we're now experiencing, in principle, could have been anticipated or at least dealt with more comprehensively if we'd taken seriously many of the prevention mechanisms that were in place to deal with this. So there certainly are some things, but the politics of this, of course, is that you get very little credit as a leader for avoiding a disaster. It's much better for your photo op and for your bragging rights to be seen sort of helping a community recover after a disaster, rather than being silently applauded for averting the disaster that, absent the mechanisms in place, would have happened. And I think that's one of the underappreciated aspects of what makes development possible, what makes rich countries rich, is that they have very well embedded insurance mechanisms that protect our houses and our bodies and our lives and our property and all the rest of it from natural disaster, from seizure, from illness. We live in a whole sea of insurance mechanisms that we often take for granted. And I think those kind of mechanisms need to be extended. Stefan Durkheim and others have stressed much more powerfully across the world, because the risk management is just a decidedly boring but incredibly consequential way in which to address many of the chronic challenges that we face. But at the end of the day, ultimately, none of these three C's, climate, conflict, and COVID, respect borders. They're global problems, and thus they require global solutions. And we conclude the report by being very strong in our, perhaps with some degree of self-interest, perhaps, but I hope it's relatively self-evident that these kinds of challenges need global cooperation, and we're going to see that enormously in the coming months now as the vaccines are produced and distributed around the world. Enormous opportunity for goodwill, enormous opportunity for seizure, for yet more taking of resourcing and disproportionately allowing those that need it the least to get it first. And so these are big historic moments. They could go either way. There's nothing foreordained about how this would go, other than a recognition of how things are likely to go given the current geopolitical and arrangements. And nonetheless, I think it's a moment for enormous leadership, both from national and local leaders, but from the international community as well, to see this as a chance for a global problem to be truly addressed at the global level, and that's where I think much of the big gains will be had going forward, is if we can finally figure out as a world community how to truly get along in this crowded house that we've created. Things were potentially heading in a much happier direction, with all the necessary caveats around the corresponding effects that a declining trend in poverty would suggest. But nonetheless, we now find ourselves perhaps paying very consequentially for the price of some of that progress. And that means correspondingly that we need to show the same kind of resolve and empathy and commitment to addressing it now as we go forward. Thanks very much. I look forward to the comments from the discussants and from your questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And so, yeah, please don't go away. You can look at the Q&A, and there are a stack of questions beginning to pile up there.
Okay.
But first, I'm going to pass over to Zainab to share with us some of her initial reactions to the report and to what you've said. And then we'll follow with some more commentary from Santosh Mehrotra. Zainab, over to you.
Thank you, James. This is a very interesting and thought-provoking report that addresses some of the major challenges we are facing in the world today. The report is presented in 4 major sections, starting with an introduction to global goals and shared challenges. The first part talks about monitoring global poverty. Second talks about shared prosperity, monitoring inclusive growth. Third looks at key socioeconomic characteristics of the global poor, vulnerability to conflict, climate risk, and COVID-19. And the fourth section looks at navigating tough terrains, sound principles, good maps, and adaptive learning. The report presents new data, original economics simulations and forecasts, and analysis that provide insights into the roots of the current reversals of economic fortune, what it means for the world's poorest, how countries are taking action to address this crisis, and how to put poverty reduction and development back on track. It provides new research that helps to explain the prolonged impoverishing impact of conflict and suggests priorities for prevention and mitigation. New estimates commissioned from what I read in the report indicate that up to 132 million people may fall into poverty by 2030 due to manifold effects of climate change. This, to me, is a very serious cause for alarm because it shows that the future is indeed dark and cloudy. New analysis focuses on the convergence of poverty and flood risks, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, and also suggests that the crisis is poised to increase inequality in much of the world. The report jointly analyzes 3 converging forces that are driving this increase in global poverty, as Michael highlighted earlier, so COVID-19, armed conflict, and climate change. There's a lot of evidence there on emerging hotspots, as mentioned also in the presentation, where multiple threats to poor people's lives and livelihoods converge. Most of these hotspots are in sub-Saharan Africa, a region already facing a lot of issues now with COVID-19. A lot of issues have been complicated. We see early evidence that the pandemic is deepening income inequality, threatening inclusive economic recovery and future growth. It shows how some countries are deploying agile and adaptive policies to reverse the crisis and protect the most vulnerable and promote a resilient recovery. It also says without an adequate global response, so in terms of cooperation and collaboration, the cumulative effects of the pandemic and its economic fallout, armed conflict, and climate change will exact high human and economic costs well into the future. It talks about advancing shared prosperity, which is really interesting to me because current projections indicate that shared prosperity will drop sharply in nearly all economics between 2020 and 2021 as the pandemic's economic burden is felt across the entire income distribution and will drop even more if impacts are disproportionately felt by people whose incomes are not adequately addressed. So some of the highlights in the report include poverty reduction, which has been shown to be slowing even before the crisis, because the world has made unprecedented progress in reducing poverty over the past quarter century, showing that collective global efforts can be achieved. But now things are changing. Shared prosperity, as we were told, was positive for the period from 2012 to 2017, but the gains have been shown to be uneven and slowing. However, with COVID, the 3 Cs, as earlier mentioned, a lot of changes have reversed the gains in poverty eradication for the first time in a generation. New findings clarify the short-term impacts and show that negative effects on poverty and inequality may extend and intensify the medium term. So here again, talking about sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, as the report says, will be the hardest hits. These scenarios describing COVID-19's future effects carry high degrees of uncertainty, given that the pandemic is still evolving. We don't have answers, but we have at least some vaccines available now, but they underline the difficulty of eradicating extreme poverty by 2030, which is the target set by the World Bank. Achieving the goal of extending extreme poverty by 2013 will require significant, swift, and sustained action to ignite inclusive growth in countries where extreme poverty persists. Frontline surveys in the report confirm swift and large losses in jobs and income from COVID-19. The early data I read indicates sweeping income and employment losses in many countries, not only in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. I think now in future, we're going to see that the effect is felt in other parts of the world. People who are already poor and vulnerable are bearing the brunt of the crisis. Women are one of the groups that were highlighted in the groups where in some countries may be suffering greater exposure to the coronavirus because of their overrepresentation in frontline health sector professions and their care responsibilities in many households. It has been argued in the report also that women face other specific health risks in the context of the pandemic because the stringent lockdown measures may lead to heightened levels of domestic violence against women and children. So without strong action, COVID-19 would definitely reduce inclusive growth and deepen inequality. One of the first and potential most destructive of these coping strategies is reducing food consumption. Early evidence in the report suggests that human capital losses due to school closures, for example, are likely to affect poor and rural children disproportionately, notably because they are often unable to engage in distance learning. The 3Cs, the impact of the 3Cs will change the profile of the global poor. As mentioned by Michael, he spoke about, the new group of the poor people, the new poor as he calls them. So the high share of children and youth among the global poor is most prominent, as they explained, in sub-Saharan Africa. But this can also be observed across most regions. The pandemic is set to increase poverty amongst groups that had been less affected. A new analysis of the findings in the report suggests that the new poor may differ from those who were poor before the onset of the pandemic in ways that are important for policy. Although a large share of the new poor will be concentrated in countries that are already struggling with high poverty rates, middle-income countries will also be significantly affected. Conflict and climate change may force rising numbers of people into poverty, as presented in the medium term. The forces propelling the upsurge in global poverty affect every part of the world, but they are hitting places like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa especially hard. So in terms of tackling the crisis while looking in the long term, the findings call for urgent action. If the global response fails the world's poor and vulnerable people now, the losses they have experienced to date may be dwarfed by what lies ahead. The World Bank says we must not fail. Not failing obviously means stopping COVID-19, but success over the long term will require much more. As efforts to curb the disease and its economic fallout intensify, the interrupted development agenda in low and middle income countries must be put back on track. So as also highlighted, policy responses need to reflect the changing profile of the poor. So we have different categories of the poor. We have the extreme poor, the dirty poor, you know, the new poor, among some of the terms that are used. Findings about the new poor, for example, have important policy implications, in particular for the design of safety nets and for measures to rebuild jobs and strengthen human capital in the recovery phase. Protecting households from the impacts of COVID-19 will require policies and programs that reach both the existing and the new poor. As mentioned also in the report, poverty actions need to address hotspots of conflict, climate change, and COVID-19. There is a need for more targeted research to clarify interactions between poverty, conflict, flood risk, and the other phenomena associated with climate change, including extreme temperature events, the prevalence of vector-borne and other diseases, and food security, among others, which is a call to us researchers now. Clearly, from this report, we have a lot of work to do. Some countries are taking action.
1 minute.
Okay, innovating and learning as they go. Although it is too soon to rigorously assess the effectiveness of such initiatives, the early results can inform future efforts. Emergency action and long-term development lessons can be shared among countries. Michael has already spoken about the 4 areas of intersection in terms of closing the gap between policy aspiration and attainment, enhancing learning and improving data, investing in preparedness and prevention, as well as expanding cooperation and coordination. So I came across interesting readings that may be of interest to many of us working on inequalities, conflict, and development. There's a lot to be done in this work, but some of the areas that to me I'm not very comfortable with has to do, you know, the issue of the reducing nature of poverty before, you know, things started changing. Because coming from sub-Saharan Africa and also from the reports, when you go down, you find that really poverty is increasing rather than reducing. So I'm really interested to understand maybe some of the measures that were used to, you know, highlight that maybe at one time poverty was reducing. The new poor is also a very interesting point raised, and I would like if Michael could give a little more explanation about it. And also, I do appreciate you said shared prosperity is hard to measure, but how does this shared prosperity work within the context of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, for example? Thank you very much. Oh, please read the report. It is very rich and detailed. A lot can be done using this report. Thank you.
Okay, Zainab, there's a lot there for us to store up. Thank you for the summary as well. We'll pass on now to Santosh.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you, Michael, for that excellent report and a very useful presentation. And I'm just going to make 3 sets of points, given how limited the time is. And my first 2 points are really mainly to agree with you, but at the same time, elaborate a little bit on what the report says. The first is about the impact of COVID on poverty in the short run. And I think you rightly conclude that Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia is going to be the worst affected. And of course, in absolute numbers, South Asia is going to be the worst hit. I know that the objective of the report is not to go into why this might be the case, but let me, you know, since I live in India and I have been working on India for some decades, let me explain why you expect South Asia to be among the worst hit. I mean, it may sound counterintuitive because you would not expect that this to be happening, that South Asia will be, India will be among the worst hit, because we've been the fastest growing large economy in the world for about 8 years, and we were the second fastest growing large economy in the world for about 15 years overall. But our growth has been worst hit of all G20 countries, certainly in the first quarter of this fiscal year 2021 and in the second quarter. In fact, growth actually contracted. I mean, the economy contracted by 24% in the first quarter and by 7.5% in this. Now, why is this the case? I would argue that there are two sets of reasons why this is what Michael argues in the report is the case, why South Asia will be worst hit. One was the nature of the lockdown, and the second was the nature of the stimulus that was put in place. So let me say a few words about the nature of the lockdown. First, it was too sudden. It was announced at 4 hours notice on the 24th of March. Roughly at the same time, South Africa announced a lockdown, but at 4 days notice. So unfortunately, there was precious little planning. Secondly, it was too early, our lockdown, in the sense that we had only 692 cases, which were all confined to the major cities, which had international airports, at the point of our going into lockdown. We now have 9.5 million cases. Thirdly, our lockdown was too wide-ranging. It was national in scope, in a country where it takes 4 hours, 5 hours to fly from north to south or east to west. And there was no need for that because 9 cities, till at least 2 months after the lockdown began, 9 cities accounted for about 80% of all cases. And finally, it was too stringent. It was among the most stringent, strictest lockdown. So the result of this nature of the lockdown was a catastrophic economic impact, which I've already talked about, with a 24% decline in quarter one, and contraction this year is almost certain. We may not get back to 1920 level of GDP in 21-22 either. Let me turn to the second point, which is the stimulus, the nature of the stimulus. The government has been claiming that the stimulus that it put in place, monetary policy and fiscal policy actions taken together, was of the order of 15% of GDP. The tragedy is that the total size of the fiscal stimulus within that is no more than 2%. Now, this is tragic when I compare it to what we put in place when I was in government in the Planning Commission after the global economic crisis 12 years ago. And the global economic crisis was not half as much a crisis for our economy. And yet, we put in place a fiscal stimulus, in addition to a monetary one, of 3.5% of GDP. And the economy rebounded within 2 quarters. So, the result is that for an economy which had been the fastest growing large economy in the world for a fair period, was already slowing because of economic mismanagement in 9 quarters running up to the pandemic breaking, and then this stimulus. So, when the report says that the long-term impact is going to be serious on absolute poverty, it's absolutely spot on. And that's exactly what we expect to see in India. Because even under the optimistic assumption, the report says that after 2021, growth returns to its historical rates, that is a per capita annualized growth rate for each country from 21 to 2030, that matches with the average rate between 2008 and 2018. Well, the pandemic's impoverishing effects will be vast, and they're absolutely spot on. Let me turn to my second point very quickly, where I agree with the report's analysis and COVID's impact on long-term inequality. And this is actually very tragic. And I again elaborate for India, because what we are expecting now is a K-shaped recovery. K-shaped meaning the rich will grow richer, because they have survived the pandemic much better, and the poor are going to get poorer. In a context where GDP levels, per capita GDP levels, are not going to return to 1920 levels until 22-23, this is tragic. And why is this happening? Because the organized sector weathered the impact of both the lockdown as well as the economic crisis following much better than the unorganized informal sector. Corporate profits have actually grown because the corporates have actually fired staff, they've reduced wages, and while on the other hand, the organized sector has seen, micro, small, medium enterprises actually closing down. So what we are now expecting, as which is consistent with Michael's analysis for South Asia generally, is that we are expecting no more than 5% per annum growth after 2023, which is seriously unfortunate because we were growing at 8% per annum between 2004 and 14, which is sort of in Michael's report, the best case scenario that we could have possibly achieved. Let me close very quickly by making a complaint about the report. It's a substantive complaint, I have to say, because one thing that one expects from international multilateral agencies when do a cross-country report like this, and I speak from experience of someone who was chief economist of the Global Human Development Report in New York, one expects to see what are the other countries doing? What is the nature of the fiscal stimulus that they have put in place? And honestly, I was relieved to see some few paragraphs about that. For instance, Indonesia put in place of 4 fiscal stimuluses, which amounted to 4.2% of GDP. Some other countries increased cash transfers. Now, this is the kind of thing which one looks for in an international report, and unfortunately, it was not there, which is a pity. And I would really request Michael, in fact, if he could share some global study of what have been the nature and content of the fiscal and monetary policy stimuli. And in closing, my last comment, if I might say, which might be, which I'm sure Michael has very little to do with, the use of this multi-dimensional poverty, where you use 3 sets of indicators: standard of living, educational attainment, and infrastructure. In other words, 3 dimensions. This is like a bit like the multidimensional poverty index of the Human Development Report. It's a melange of input indicators, process indicators, output indicators, and outcome indicators. How you can mix up and produce an index of input, output, process, and outcome indicators, baffles me. But I'm sure this is just a minor complaint, and it's not something that Michael could have done anything about. But thank you very much for that. Congratulations.
What I've proposed to do, Michael, is to take just to share with you 2 questions that have come up in the Q&A and give you a chance to respond to those 2 and pick up on anything you want to pick up on from Santosh and Zainab. Is that okay? Just to get some of the audience questions into the mix before we run out of time, and then we can go back to the many other questions that are coming thick and fast. So the 2 questions I've picked out, one is from Chaideftos, and he has asked about digital cash transfers and what scope is there for bringing poverty down, extreme poverty, in ways unimagined through cash transfers, UBI policies to points of sale, now that the world is becoming more digitalized. And that connects with other questions about changing in World Bank priorities away from long-term development towards immediate humanitarian relief. So I think there's an interesting line of questions there, associated also with the prioritization of the extreme poor, with these other indicators coming into the dashboard. And then the second question I think we'd like to get to at some stage is where maybe you weren't allowed to say so much in the report itself about what the causes are of the 3 Cs, and particularly the responsibility of rich countries in this context. And a number of questioners have asked the question about degrowth and what lessons we learned from 2020 about the extent to which we link poverty reduction with economic growth, or maybe the extent to which the wrong kinds of growth can exacerbate poverty. So if you could pick up in some way on those two, and Santosh and Zainab, and then we'll see where we are.
Great. I'll just give, I hope, short answers to these. They're good questions, and I'm grateful for everybody. It's certainly to the discussants, to Santosh and Zainab, but also to those that have taken the time to put their questions in. The nature of a global report is that it does its work when it enables the kinds of more specific, country-specific, district-specific levels of conversation around these particular issues. So I'm not going to try to answer the details. I guess I'll just do what a global report tries to do, which is to keep things at a big picture kind of level. The first is that I think it's important to recognize that the World Bank is one actor among many in the multilateral space and in the international community of organizations. Our mission and mandate is to work with governments and on medium to long run development strategies. The IMF exists to deal with those issues in the short run, to sort of deal with countries in crises and to prevent them and to deal with them in the short run. But the World Bank is the whole logic of projects and policy reform. All that we do is largely a medium term, longer term development effort. And so I'm very sympathetic personally to the idea that to get that happening, in some sense, you also need to have moments when you recognize genuine humanitarian need and respond accordingly. And I think a lot of the World Bank's work most recently, which we don't really highlight in the report too much, but is certainly a big part of it, is dealing with the debt issues that are associated with responding to this crisis, because it just costs huge sums of money to do anything, but to do anything at scale and to target people in the right way with the right kind of resources. All that's just going to take countries that were already in a pretty precarious fiscal situation into even deeper waters. So I think it can be legitimately cast as humanitarian to see that if one particular set of international organizations can help countries to get their fiscal house in order, that frees up money for them to do things that they might not otherwise be able to do, and that then becomes indirect but very powerful and consequential humanitarian response. But the World Bank doesn't do everything. It does what it's supposed to do, and other organizations need to be given the space to do what they do. I'm actually, for a sociologist, I've become very convinced of the importance of economic growth. There's a table that we would have had, and I will use subsequently, where we look at historically, anytime, anywhere, ever, what is the level of economic development you've had to have to get your country to 3% level of extreme poverty reduction, right? And the answer is about $1,300 GDP per capita. No country anywhere in the world ever has got its poverty reduction, has got poverty below 3% until it's grown to a level at which it's about $1,300 GDP, right? And it's the graph that you can show on that is just so ironclad. But then you can other countries like Nigeria, for example, that have GDP per capita of nearly $5,500 GDP, who still haven't reduced extreme poverty, right? So there's this very real question about the conditions under which growth benefits the rich or the poor, the conditions under which the type of growth you generate from mowing down your forests and polluting your waters generates your growth versus one that's much more environmentally sustainable, etc. But I usually sort of describe growth as like fire, right? Growth can be a candle at a romantic dinner in a restaurant. It can be the hearth that keeps you warm in winter, or it can be a blaze that burns the whole, an inferno that burns the city to the ground. That doesn't mean we criticize fire. It just means we've got to have a much more constrained way of harnessing the power of fire to do what fire is supposed to do and not let it get wildly out of control. And I think that's roughly, crudely, but one way to think about economic growth. That fire was one of humans' greatest inventions when humans hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago figured out how to create sparks and create fires to keep themselves warm and to cook their food. That was a huge innovation. The fact that it could also then burn down the forest they lived in wasn't a reason for arguing against fire. It was a reason for how do we constrain this amazing technology that we've just built? And I see growth in that same kind of way. It's something that is really important for getting us to a world where people don't have to worry about where their next meals are coming from. That world of 40% of poverty down to 8% of poverty that I described in the opening slide happens because of economic growth. But it's the price we pay for that, or the deal you enter into, so to speak, and the world has entered into, is that by creating all these systems that are integrated, it just means that the goods and the bads travel down the same highways. And I don't think we need a deep theory of the world to explain why the pandemic has become what it has been. The world's had pandemics forever. This one just happens to have spread faster and at scale all around the world because of the infrastructure we've built in that enables nice travel to other countries, enables us to wear clothes coming from other countries, to use cell phones made in 20 different countries. All those good things of globalization can just be used for the harmful purposes as well. And how you create a world that has a sufficiently legitimate and effective regulatory structure to distinguish between the goods and the bads is the 21st century challenge. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss the challenge itself. It means that we should see it as the upsides being genuinely very up, but with concomitant risks that things could go very wrong. And we should know that's the nature of any big thing that humans invent, whether it was bureaucracies or armies or fire or money. I mean, all these things can be used for awful purposes. And it's trying to figure out how to get the benefits and minimize the costs. That's the really crucial issue. So I'll leave it there for the moment. There's other questions that are similar to those that I might be able to address in one final round. Thanks.
Okay. Any reactions to any of the other questions you've read that you'd particularly like to pick up, Michael, or to Santosh and Zainab?
Yeah, the multidimensional thing, I think the various reasonable people can have different views on all of that. We tried to present it not as a single index, but to keep them separated. And I think that if I took one storyline out from the multidimensional stuff, it was that there wasn't a singular story. It's not redundant to have multiple measures. Sometimes it is, though. In some countries, the correlation between those three different dimensions is 0.9. In other countries like Niger, I think, it's like 0.3. You can have really different kinds of stories you would tell about the ways you can be poor and deprived of access to services. Looks very different, at least if you take the numbers seriously, at face value even. They tell very different stories. And I think that's what good analysis is. It's not about, oh, we've found the way in which we can now array poverty and tell ourselves consistently a whole bunch of new things that we didn't know before. It turns out that in maybe 25% of the countries in the world, you now get a more interesting poverty story because you've got a multi-dimensional aspect. That means 75% of it can be addressed pretty comprehensively just by worrying about income. But if you're the president of Niger, you need to know that there's a whole bunch of different forces in play that are shaping the extent to which your people are poor, and you need to kind of be doing something about that. So I think rather than seeing our job as trying to create a new single index, it's about trying to recognize the heterogeneity of outcomes that these new measures create, and that in itself can then become a new and fruitful source of conversation. On what the world should be doing about it, yes, in principle, I'm very sympathetic to that. We tried to create a whole bunch of hyperlinks in the report, at least the online version of it, because we were very conscious that whatever any country was doing that we might celebrate in a report writing in August could turn out to be a bust by the time the report was launched in October. So we thought it best just to provide lots of links to the different sectors of the World Bank, whether it's in the trade or the macro, or the fiscal, the health, education, social protection, whatever. Just probably all the places where the bank itself is trying to create repositories of examples of what countries are doing, but also just to try and then curate those lessons into something that starts to share what some of those best responses are looking like. So the nature of a concluding chapter was that we could only highlight a few of those examples, but take those as being indicative of a broader array of ways in which countries are responding. Their efficacy is still uncertain, but nonetheless providing some tangible online link to real-time information, which would be hopefully a more accurate way of gauging in real time what the effectiveness of these responses had been. So that's what that's another stoppage point. If others have got a few other questions they want to pose, I'm happy to weigh in on that as well.
Mike, can you hear me now? I was just going to suggest we pass the floor quickly to Gordon Corford in Coventry, who had a question.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my question was, especially in the current context, should there now be more emphasis on decreasing inequalities as a means to sustain poverty reduction. So in some ways, I think this also pertains to the discussions about economic growth and degrowth. But as especially linking the question to notions of redistribution as a means of decreasing current inequalities. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very timely question. I think, at least in the United States here, the glaring paradox of stock markets setting daily records and record unemployment just suggests that we've created parallel economic worlds, essentially, where, as Santosh said, we've got a K situation going on where the rich are getting richer and the poor are just struggling to figure out where their next meal's coming from and how to pay their rent. So at a macro level, yes, in the report we tried to show very, I hope compellingly, that the effects of inequality have always been real, but they're especially real now. And that they're just, as an empirical matter, the consequences for not stemming the rising inequality are going to be enormous in terms of ensuring that this fire of economic growth warms everybody and not just those who happen to live in nice houses. So there's enormous amounts of work to be done there. My sort of slightly broader concern is with inequality issues is always with process legitimacy concerns, how and why we get these forms of inequality. And you know, when economists are being more neutral or trying to be more neutral of this space and talking about skill-biased technical change and the fact that we've just created a world where there are increasing returns to those people who earn a living from doing more analytical work that requires more education, etc. I mean, I think there's something to be said about that. But it's those kind of stories that then would prompt these bigger questions. Well, does that, even if that's a legitimate reason for why income inequality is rising or wealth inequality is rising, does that in turn then as a society say, well, we're all in this together, and the ways in which people are becoming wealthier through public education, through public transport, and through public infrastructure mean that we just have a much more rich conversation about how we do that redistributing. But when inequality is happening just because people get away with whatever they want to get away with, when the powerful people can do everything from own courts and write rules and influence foreign leaders and all the rest of it to get the outcomes they want, then clearly there's just gross violations of process legitimacy that calls for very different kinds of responses, and just redistributing in a world in which the systems themselves are wildly inequitable and perceived and as such by everybody. Then that's what politics is supposed to be about, is about how you create coalitions that figure out how to fix those systems, to build rules and enforceable rules that are perceived by and are legitimate in the eyes of those that have to live with the consequences of it. And those are the more wrenching challenges, I think. Whether we increase or decrease this or that taxation system is part of the conversation, but how we ensure that the rules of the game by which everybody perceives themselves to be playing are themselves legitimate, and then the referees and umpires that we invoke to call the situations in each instance, those themselves need to be part of this conversation about how legitimacy is sustained. And those are the big questions that development just churns up, because all this nice 8% growth that we're talking about, it's the Schumpeterian processes of creative destruction that growth puts in place, that from around migration and all the rest of it, those are the big, long understood, but now playing out at a global stage effects that we need to be much more conscious about. And I think that's what some of those issues are what we originally thought we were going to be writing the whole report on. But by April and May, it was clear that nobody was really wanting a conversation around that. They wanted a toolkit for dealing with COVID. And so we had an imperative that we needed to meet. But I think the issues that have animated me throughout my whole career, and which I've spoken about at Bath on several other occasions, is just the importance of simultaneously understanding how we promote a growth process, but how we tame it and how we see it being something that answers and benefits everybody and not just the few.
So I just said thank you, Michael, and that's a timely reminder of all your work on the challenge of building state capability and more effective judicial systems that remains. So maybe we'll add those to the list, Zainab, of agenda items for the follow-on seminars we're planning in the new year. We're hoping that we can continue to have some joint seminars on these topics between Coventry and Bath. And so watch this space and the IPR space. I think from this talk, having armed ourselves a little bit with some of the harsh facts of what's happened, we will probably need to move on to thinking about the political implications. There were many questions we didn't manage to answer that came up, including whether cutting the aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5% of GDP is a timely way of promoting collective action and doing all the other things you argued. So, and we have to look at that very seriously. It's not a throwaway issue. It raises lots of important questions. So I'm sorry we haven't been able to do more to address all those questions, but I hope this has, at the very least, as Zainab has said, encouraged others to look at this report, which is an attempt to tell us where we're at in multiple dimensions in relation to not just COVID, but also climate and conflict, and makes a very solid, I think, starting point for informed conversations. So thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Santosh and Zainab, as both visiting fellows to the Centre of Development Studies. And a big thank you finally.